Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up today, we'll get the latest on the diplomatic efforts to end the war in Ukraine and ask, how likely is it that a bilat between Presidents Putin and Zelensky will actually happen? Plus, we speak to Ambassador Barbara Leaf of the United States, one of the first US diplomats to engage with the new leadership in Syria. We'll be asking her how she thinks they've fared during these past 9 months. Hello and welcome to the programme. The US President Donald Trump is pushing for a direct summit between Russia's President Vladimir Putin and Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky. Well, the White House says the talks are on the way, but the Kremlin is downplaying this with no confirmation yet. Well, the push comes after President Trump met President Putin in Alaska last week and hosted President Zelensky alongside 7 European leaders in Washington on Monday. Well, President Trump first floated the idea of a 3-way summit, but now he says it's better if Presidents Putin and Zelensky meet one-on-one without him. Well, he's also admitted that the Ukrainian conflict is, quote, a tough one to solve. Well, helping President Trump with the Ukraine situation is, of course, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is heading a US-European-Ukrainian commission to draft security guarantees. Well, while those plans would not put American troops on the ground, it could see the US providing air support, backing any European forces stationed in Ukraine. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Matt Terrell, former Chief of Staff to the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. It was confirmed yesterday that Marco Rubio is going to lead a working group to draft a proposal for security guarantees for Ukraine. We'll talk about those in just a moment, but I just want to sort of get your overall sense of where things have headed during the course of the last week. Because we spoke to one Russian yesterday who is now no longer supportive of the Russian leadership, and he seemed to think very much the same sort of thing that the former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who served President Biden, seems to think, which is this: President Putin is taking everybody for a ride. What do you say to that?
What I say is, with all due respect to those who served in the Biden administration or the Obama administration, President Putin invaded Ukraine under President Obama. President Putin invaded Ukraine under President Biden. And under the Biden administration, you saw, in my view, zero progress in getting this war to come to an end. President Trump is making tremendous progress in getting this war to come to an end. It's something he promised he would do on the campaign trail. It's something he's trying to deliver on. And we saw just last Friday in Alaska, President Trump, I think, make great progress in that meeting. It sounds like on the heels of that meeting, you're seeing President Putin open to security guarantees. We'll see what that all looks like. But the bigger thing I think you're seeing here in the micro is the potential to get to a peace deal. And that, to get there, what's critical is to get President Zelensky and President Putin to the negotiating table. You're not going to end this war on the battlefield. You're going to end this war at the negotiating table, and that means getting both President Putin and President Zelensky in the room to negotiate an end of this war. We'll see where that all goes with next steps, but President Trump is making tremendous progress on getting this war to come to an end.
Sure. I mean, President Trump has the admirable goal of putting a stop to the deaths of civilians, the deaths of soldiers on both sides. He doesn't like killing, and he's made that very, very clear. He wants to put a stop to that. But there's a paradox here, which is the fact that, there'll be no ceasefire, for example. The ceasefire idea seems to have gone out of the window. A ceasefire would have put a stop to the fighting and then paved the way to a peace deal. And now the fighting will continue. A peace deal will take as long as it takes. And more killing will happen, more people will die on both sides. So don't you think that ceasefire step should not have been overlooked?
Well, look, we've seen President Putin break ceasefires before. And I think where the Trump administration is at on this is, look, if you can get to an actual peace deal, that could be more concrete than a ceasefire. We've seen ceasefires break, but peace deals can often last. And the goal, though, in the end, is to get to a macro end of this war, a sustained, permanent end of this war. And whether you do that in a ceasefire or a peace deal, the bigger dynamics are certainly stopping the killing, stopping the violence, getting that to end, And this peace deal could be a step towards doing that, not just in the short term, but the long term. But the bigger elements of this is recognizing this will take time. Whether you have a ceasefire or a peace deal, the true end of this war, I think, will take time to get done. I think we have a lot of work ahead of us here, as the United States does, and President Trump does, and Europe and President Zelensky have a lot of work ahead in terms of getting this war to come to an end. But ultimately it comes down to getting to that negotiating table. And I think one of the biggest things you got out of this over the past couple of days in terms of these meetings was getting President Putin to agree to meet with President Zelensky. So let's see what happens with that bilateral meeting. The bigger elements of that are getting to what needs to be done to get the war to come to a permanent end. That's going to be covering security guarantees, certainly land, and then what role does Europe play in that, and what role does the United States play in all of that? I think President Trump is making tremendous progress on getting what you need in the short term here, and that is getting President Zelensky, President Putin to the negotiating table, and then from there figuring out what can be done to get this to be not just a short-term ceasefire, but to get to be a long-term permanent end of the war.
Right, and Secretary of State Rubio has a tough few weeks ahead of him, making the arrangements for the bilat to happen. But again, going back to the Russia military man we spoke to yesterday, who said, Putin's playing everyone along and he's playing for time and he'll just carry on grabbing territory for as long as he can, seems to think that bilat is never going to happen. I mean, this is just a pipe dream, he says. What does President Trump and what do Marco Rubio do in a situation where they reach a point where they realize that simply these face-to-face meetings aren't going to happen? What would they do?
I think the next steps are going to be crushing Russia's economy. And I suspect President Trump has made it clear to President Putin, in one way or the other, that if he does not come to the table here with President Zelensky in this bilateral meeting and really work towards getting a negotiated end of this war, really work towards ending this war in the for a permanent end here, then I think President Trump will take the next steps of putting maximum pressure sanctions and tariffs on Russia. The real question is what got President Putin to be in Alaska on Friday in the first place. And I think has been that President Putin has been watching what President Trump has been doing. He saw what President Trump did in terms of selling weapons to Ukraine. He saw what President Trump did in terms of the airstrikes against Iran when Iran didn't get to the negotiating table in time. And he saw what President Trump just recently did on putting those secondary tariffs on India being a major consumer of Russia oil from Russia. So look, the bottom line is you've got to get to a place where President Putin is feeling the pressure, and that's going to be economically. And I think if President Putin does not come to the table here and really work towards peace here and an end of this war, you're going to see President Trump take next steps, put that economic pressure on President Putin. You're seeing right now inflation around 20% in Russia. Russia has a very imbalanced economy right now. They're hurting economically. That's the real pressure point when it comes to influence President Putin.
Sure. I mean, a lot of the economic indicators for Russia look pretty bleak. I absolutely agree with you on that. But some people have questioned whether those talks in Alaska should have happened at all. They say the dialogue and the Alaska invitation were all a victory for President Putin, and a victory he doesn't deserve. He is the aggressor who invaded a sovereign nation, they argue. What do you say to that argument?
I would say the only way you end this war is that have both parties, President Putin and President Zelensky, get to the negotiating table. On the heels of that meeting on Friday in Alaska, you're seeing President Putin, sounds like, going to be taking the next steps to meet with President Zelensky in that bilateral meeting. That's the only way this war ends. And the other component of this is, look, it seems like all we talk about right now is this war between Russia and Ukraine. The notion that President Trump is, kind of bringing President Putin out of the cold, if you will, I just don't believe that. I think every day it seems like we're talking about this war. A tremendous amount of money has been spent on this war. The U.S. has spent a tremendous amount of money in terms of aiding Ukraine here. But the bigger thing here is that people are losing their lives every day, every week. Bloodshed, and that needs to stop. And the only way you stop the killing, the bloodshed, the violence is getting President Zelensky and President Putin in the room to negotiate an end of this war. And I think President Trump has made tremendous steps, clearly, on doing exactly that. That wouldn't have happened unless you had that meeting on Friday. You wouldn't have had President Putin agree to a bilateral meeting unless President Trump sat down with President Putin on Friday to work out what needs to be done to get a meeting with President Zelensky and President Putin and to get the next steps and really getting to where we need to be on getting this war to come to an end. Security guarantees, land, that'll be discussed. But discussions are one thing. Actions are the next steps here. And the next action here is having that meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky. We'll have to wait and see what happens with that.
I mean, do you think it's fair to say that up until this point, I mean, if we look back to February, when we could perhaps say that relations between President Zelensky and President Trump were at an all-time low, if we move forward from that point onwards to, things looking pretty cordial on Monday in the Oval Office, I mean, it seems these last 6 months, President Zelensky has done everything that's been asked of him. He's entered all discussions in good faith. Yes, he's open to a ceasefire. Yes, he's open to all sorts of discussions, face-to-face meetings with President Putin, all the rest of it. And yet, it doesn't seem like, for all the concessions that have been made by him or on his behalf, there's been a single concession delivered by the Russians. Has there been one? If so, what was it?
Yeah, the biggest concession right now is that President Putin is open to security guarantees. That's a major concession. And look, the truth is both sides are going to give up things here. And the reality is that may require land. We'll see what happens with that. That's up to Ukraine to make that decision at the end of the day. And you can argue this is not right or not fair, but the realities are what they are on the ground. And the determination needs to be made here is what needs to be done to get to a permanent end of this war and to ensure Russia never invades again. That's the key elements here. And so, look, those are the things that need to be discussed, particularly this next bilateral meeting or this upcoming bilateral meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky. But look, ultimately, the United States is continuing to play a big role in this. You're seeing President Trump lead on this. And part of that will be, the United States talking about Article 5, Article 5 like security guarantees here. You've seen the U.S. Ukraine Minerals Agreement, that in its own right serves as a security guarantee. So none of this happened overnight. You're seeing President Putin take action and movement here towards this meeting because he's feeling the pressure. It just comes down to what needs to be done to get the war to come to an end. Ultimately, Ukraine needs to make decisions of what they'll do with the land and other dynamics here. President Putin right now has made a concession on security guarantees. We'll see where that all goes, really get under the hood on that. Comes down to this next meeting. That's a big next step here.
What were your thoughts, Matt, about how Monday went? I mean, it was a pretty unprecedented scene. I mean, the Oval Office almost didn't look big enough to accommodate the number of people in town, all those European leaders alongside President Zelensky. Firstly, what effect do you think it had having those European leaders there backing up President Zelensky? What message did that send out?
Well, I think it's a great message. It shows unity. It shows that these leaders are all serious about getting this war to come to an end. Granted, I think Europe needs to be doing some work in terms of getting off Russian oil. You're seeing those kind of things are still in discussion here. But overall, you're seeing unity among President Trump and these European leaders. And, this is a team effort at the end of the day. And we talk about security guarantees. Europe's going to be playing, obviously, a major role in that. You're going to see the United States aiding and supporting in certain ways in security guarantees. But security guarantees are a major component of ending this war. They're obviously critical to President Zelensky in Ukraine. So to have these world leaders in the Oval Office working together to get this war to come to an end is critical. And it's showing President Putin that the world is united. European leaders and President Trump are united and standing together to get this war to come to an end. And part of this is the economic pressure that needs to be applied to President Putin. You've seen that, obviously, with secondary tariffs on India. You also saw that, though, in that recent EU-U.S. trade deal, where part of that trade deal was from the EU, $750 billion invested from the EU in U.S. energy. That's $750 billion that is not going to be going from the EU towards Russian energy. So you're seeing a lot of different things take place here between European leaders and President Trump working together. That's what needs to happen to get this war to come to an end. I'm confident that those kind of things that we saw in the Oval Office, those kind of things right now are going to be the key ingredients to getting the war to come to an end. But it's going to be an and not or approach. You got to do multiple things here, obviously, to get this war to be a conclusion. But the next big step here is going to be, of course, that bilateral meeting. And then from there, figuring out what happens with land, security guarantees. A lot more work needs to be done, but a lot of progress being made here over the past couple of days.
Right, Matt, let me put you on the spot here. When you looked at the screen on Monday, you saw all those European leaders there alongside President Trump, alongside President Zelensky. Did you get the impression there was one leader who stood out as being more assertive, more visible, more audible? Do you think there's one European leader that perhaps President Trump listens to more than all the others?
Look, I think he's listening to all of them. I mean, you're seeing he's got a really I think, great rapport with a lot of these leaders, all these leaders. You're seeing him, kind of, work with, the leader of France. You're seeing the president, various leaders here praising what President Trump is doing here. The leader of Finland coming out and praising what President Trump is doing. I think you're seeing a lot of praise from these leaders for what President Trump doing. It's rightful praise. I mean, I think they're seeing President Trump be strong here in the sense of really taking a leadership role of getting this war to come to an end. And candidly, you didn't see that under President Biden. I think these European leaders do recognize they've made zero progress under President Biden on ending this war. And I think President Trump is just working with them in a lot of different ways to be a team here to get this war to come to an end. And you did see European leaders step up to doing 5% of defense spending, NATO doing 5% of defense spending. You're seeing European leaders talk about stepping up here on security guarantees for Ukraine. Really, at the end of the day, there's not one nation that can be the ones who are going to be helping Ukraine here. It's got to be all of these nations, United States included, working together to bring this thing to an end. And obviously, President Trump is playing a major role in that. There's only one world leader, though, at the end of the day that can really get this war to come to an end, and that is President Trump. He's the only person on the planet right now that can really get this war to conclude. And I think right now, these European leaders recognize the work that he's doing to get this war to really be not just a short-term end, but a permanent end. That's the goal here.
Yeah, and on fair terms. And just to wrap up, Matt, I mean, the bottom line here is we're in a situation where Russia controls around 20% of Ukrainian territory for now, maybe more if they keep fighting and the peace process takes considerably longer. That sends out a message to the rest of the world, to other world leaders in other parts of the world, that invading sovereign countries is obviously worth it, and it's rewarding because you walk away with sizable chunks of territory that you didn't own before the fighting started. How does President Trump avoid letting that message get out to the wider world?
Well, there's no question the world is watching what's happening right now. I know people are talking about China, Taiwan, and the dynamics there. Look, the reality is the world is watching what President Trump is doing in the sense of recognizing that he is being a strong leader right now, I think many would argue. And look, the world recognizes that this war didn't start under President Trump, it started under President Biden. And at the end of the day, President Trump is trying to do what he can do to get the war to come to an end. And what they're seeing right now is President Trump taking action. They're also seeing him do this not just with Ukraine and Russia, but action towards securing multiple peace deals around the world. So look, President Trump is on the march right now to be a president that's going to secure peace around the world. That is clearly a part of his agenda. And look, I think these world leaders around the world are going to look at what President Trump is doing and recognize that he's being serious about trying to get this war to come to an end. It's not just talk; he's taking action. You've seen him do that through providing, selling weapons to Ukraine. You're seeing him do that with the strikes on Iran when they did not get to the negotiating table. You're seeing him do that through trade deals and tariffs. Tariffs are a key component of President Trump's agenda, particularly on foreign policy, because he's been using tariffs to try to negotiate with world leaders and trying to get peace around the world. So look, the world is watching what's happening right now. And I think they're recognizing the work that President Trump is doing and the progress that President Trump is making. It's a war that should have never started. It's a war that started under President Biden. And I think it's a war that's going to end under President Trump. I think the world is watching what President Trump is doing. And it's clear that he's making a lot of progress. And we'll see where next steps go.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Matt Terrell, former Chief of Staff to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. A real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Well, let's get more analysis, and we can speak to our next guest today, who is Lieutenant General David Leakey, former Director General of the European Union Military Staff. He joins us from the United Kingdom. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Always a pleasure talking to you. It's been a very busy 5 days, hasn't it, with regards to diplomacy and the efforts to bring about an end to this war in Ukraine. Are you encouraged by what you've been seeing and hearing by way of the diplomatic efforts made by the Trump administration?
Yes, I am. I'm very encouraged that by two things. One is that the Europeans and the US are now working, if they're not on the same page, they're in the same chapter at least. There are bound to be some disagreements on the policy and the terms of the settlement and so on. But by and large, they seem to be on the same page, if not the same chapter. I'm also encouraged that President Zelensky has been included in this. It's a multilateral atmosphere in which these talks are taking place. And that's vital because Russia and Ukraine and the US are not the only stakeholders. This is a European security problem, and the European leaders need to be deeply engaged. There's another reason, and that is that the US has said they won't put boots on the ground and they won't get directly engaged in this as regards security guarantees for whatever peace agreement or ceasefire agreement is landed on. And therefore, it requires the Europeans to be directly engaged, particularly in setting the conditions and then the mission for whatever security guarantees, particularly on the ground in the region, are made.
I want to talk to you a bit more about security guarantees in just a moment, but one area where it seemed that there was a bit of a difference in opinion as to what the right way to proceed was between the Europeans and the Americans was on the issue of a ceasefire. President Trump, following his talks with President Putin on Friday in Alaska, seems to be of the view that we can leapfrog from where we are now straight to the peace deal and not have a ceasefire agreement. The Europeans seem to think it was important that they got their point across that they would like one. Do you think it's significant there'll be no ceasefire?
My experience, and I commanded twice in Bosnia for the stabilization and peace implementation forces in Bosnia in 1995 and 2004, following the Dayton Peace Agreement, which brought peace to the Bosnian conflict. And I've had experience of quite a few other ends to wars where I've been involved directly or indirectly. And my experience is that you need a honeymoon, if I can put it that way. In other words, from the moment that there is a general agreement that you're going to have peace, it normally takes time to work out the details of that, and therefore there has to be a ceasefire. I'll give you an example of this, and that is in Bosnia in 1995, the US managed to get all three of the warring factions and the supporting states behind them, Serbia, Croatia, got them to agree that the war had played itself out. There needed now to be a peace agreement. They all agreed, and a ceasefire was agreed immediately. But it took another 2 months before the peace agreement was finally signed. And the peace agreement, the so-called Dayton Accord, took 4 weeks of negotiations between the parties and the security guarantees, which included the Europeans, it included the UK, Russia, France, Germany, and the European Union with the US, all negotiating together, actually locked up in one of the air bases in Dayton, Ohio, where we were corralled for what they call proximity talks, which means you live in a wild enclave, imprisoned in there, and you're told to beat out the peace agreement until you've done it, and then you can come out. And that's what happened. That took a month, and that was Bosnia. Now, we haven't got an agreement, so far as we know, on the general principles. So the biggest general principle of this regards territory. And are there going to be territory swaps? And is that just a territory agreement, or is it a sovereignty agreement? And so the nature of this and the details, particularly, you may have heard President Trump, during his meeting with the European leaders or his commentary afterwards, talking about the exact percentage of the Donbass which the Russians on that day controlled. I think the figure he quoted was 79%. Now, if there is going to be a division of territories, and I look back again to Bosnia in 1995, the percentages agreed about which of the warring factions would have what percentage of Bosnia. It took a very long time to draw the lines on the maps to delineate where those sort of front lines, or not front, we knew where the front lines were, but the front lines weren't the same as where the territorial allocation was given. And we needed a ceasefire to buffer us between stopping the fighting on day one and implementing the terms and the details of the ceasefire agreement, which happened on about, I think it was about day 90. So it can take a long time. So I'm very surprised that there won't be a ceasefire followed by a peace agreement. But if the Zelensky, Trump, Putin talks can deliver all the necessary headlines, so that there can be a ceasefire and a peace agreement straight away.
Okay.
But as part of that peace agreement, there has to be a transition from where things are today, where the fighting in the front line is today, and where the territorial limits are going to be as part of the peace agreement. There will be a time frame because the troops have to withdraw or indeed advance. And it may be that there are some details about removing some of the defensive measures that have been put in place. That could be part of it. For example, lifting minefields that have been laid by one or other of the protagonists. So there's a lot of detail to be covered in here.
Yeah, and I mean, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, the fact that President Putin seems to have successfully persuaded President Trump last Friday, because President Trump was talking about a ceasefire until last Friday, now he's not talking about a ceasefire. The fact that President Putin doesn't seem to want one, I mean, shouldn't we be reading something into that and something rather cynical?
Well, I don't want to be too rude about President Putin, but he and his diplomats and generals have been capricious and mendacious and mercurial throughout this. And not just this recent 2.5 years of the Ukraine conflict, but if you go back to the invasion and the occupation by Russia of Crimea, after that there were the accords agreed on that on all sorts of terms by which the Russians remained in Crimea. But the Russians have reneged on almost every single article that was agreed between Russia and Ukraine after that. So in some senses, we shouldn't enjoy a sense of achievement on an agreement with Putin until such time as he has signed on the dotted line, and until such time as not just the headlines, but some of the details and timetables are agreed. As I think Donald Trump has said many times, until the deal is done, the deal isn't done. And but I just don't think that the Russians. Well, let me answer your question directly about the ceasefire and the peace agreement. I think it will take a long time for the peace agreement to be agreed. The reason Putin doesn't want a ceasefire is that he wants to continue the pressure on Ukraine and the attacks and the advances he's making in the Donbass region. He wants to continue that until the absolute last possible moment. And that's why he doesn't want a ceasefire. Because if today or tomorrow or next week, they agree that they've agreed, say, the outline headlines of the deal, that there are going to be some territory swaps, it may be in certain percentages, that there are going to be some general security guarantees, you might get some headlines of the agreement. And Putin will say, fine, well, we won't have a ceasefire until we've done the detail on that. And the detail may take another month or two to work out. And that's the beauty of a ceasefire. At least if you've got the headlines of agreement, you declare a ceasefire, the fighting then stops. And then you've got time to work out the detail. Okay. But again, who would have any guarantee that the ceasefire would hold? Traditionally, ceasefires are breached by both sides, and I've had experience of that in many of the operations that I've experienced and seen, either directly or indirectly. So I think we've got a way to go before we discover what the conditions are going to be before security guarantees are agreed.
Okay,
I want to talk about security guarantees.
I do in just a moment, but I just want to pick up finally on a couple of points you've made, which is that it sounds from what you're saying and how these things play out with ceasefires leading to peace deals. The fact that President Putin and his forces seem to have the upper hand currently on the ground in Ukraine. They want to play a long game so they can continue capturing territory so that when a deal is signed, obviously they've got as much territory as they can possibly capture. But does any of this make it sound to you like President Putin wants a deal? I mean, what do you think the chances are of these bilat and trilat meetings even happening?
And this is a purely personal view. I would put it at 50% as at today, 50% chance of it happening. And the reason I say 50% on the one hand is because President Putin has insisted consistently over the last months, weeks, and years for that matter, that his aim of this operation is to subjugate Ukraine and bring it into the Russian Federation, which is where he believes it historically, politically, militarily, strategically belongs. Now, he has not deviated from that aim at all, and he's not renounced that aim. So that makes me 50% skeptical about whether he really wants a peace agreement or whether he's just going to go through the motions and blame everybody else for the peace talks breaking down. Well, on the other hand, the 50% that argues that we will get a deal is that the cost to Russia of continuing this war, even as things stand at today, is enormous. The Russians have suffered 1 million casualties of dead, missing in action, wounded. 1 million is an awful lot of people. And if he is to go on pursue his ambition without a peace agreement, then the cost of that in human terms is going to rise exponentially. And moreover, the military cost as well. It is extremely expensive. And behind that is the cost to his economy. The Russian economy is on a war footing. We know it's been subsisting on considerable reserves that it built up before the war, but those are beginning to run out. Its economy is not doing as well. And for the future of the economy, it can't survive indefinitely on a war economy footing. It needs to establish a non-war economy footing for the benefit of its well-being and the welfare and the growth of its society. And to that, I would add, if the Americans, the Europeans, and other countries weigh in with some really effective sanctions, then those two factors of the military cost and the cost to the Russian economy of sanctions, I think that's the other 50%. So I think the Russians find themselves caught between, we are really going to, by pursuing this Ukraine objective now, we are really going to hamper the Russian economy, the Russian state. We're going to bankrupt ourselves on this. And I think that's the issue for the Russians. What worries me about it is that whatever peace agreement is made will not be an enduring one. We saw that after Crimea. It didn't take the Russians very long to breach all the agreements, or most of the agreements of that, including their invasion of Ukraine. So I think they'll be hell-bent on having a peace agreement, and then they will find some excuse in years to come, maybe 2, 4, 8, 10 years, probably 8, 10 years is my guess, when everybody's forgotten, there's a generation has forgotten that this war happened. The generation of this who makes this peace agreement will be 2 presidents further down the line in the US. They won't remember exactly the details and the drama that went on. And hey presto, a bit like Crimea, the Russians will have another go, unless the Ukrainians have really rock solid security guarantees for this peace agreement. And that will involve we'll need to see what that is going to be involved. I mean, we can spend the next 20 minutes speculating on the spectrum of options of security guarantees, because they are a huge spectrum of options. I mean, just to give you one example of how wide the spectrum is, it's not just on the land, boots on the ground, which a lot of people talk about, but it's policing from the air, it's satellite imagery, it's intelligence sharing, all these sorts of things. When NATO went into Bosnia to implement the Dayton Accord, which brought peace to Bosnia, the plan was to put 40,000 NATO troops into Bosnia. Now, the length of the front lines and the square kilometerage of that whole operation is minuscule compared to what is going on in Ukraine. It's on a completely industrial scale in Ukraine compared to, if I can put it that way, a village scale in as it was in Bosnia in 1995. So if you were really to put boots on the ground to act as a tripwire, a security guarantee that could intervene to help implement and impose the details of the peace agreement, then you'd be talking about an enormous force, and that's simply not practicable. So I am sure that the European military chiefs who've been meeting over the last months and making up plans will have a spectrum of operations, a spectrum of potential plans that they can do, and underpinning each of those will be force levels, command and control organizations, intelligence sharing organizations, and probably some draft troop contribution ideas as well.
Yeah, I mean, what's extraordinary is that throughout this process, this diplomatic process, the discussion about a ceasefire or no ceasefire, the concessions that have been made on Ukraine's behalf verbally by the US president, I mean, all along, it sounds like, you know, everyone is dancing to Russia's tune here. And even on the subject of security guarantees, the Russians have said something today along the lines of security guarantees without our involvement and running them by us first, or words to that effect, aren't worth the paper they're written on. I mean, doesn't it sound rather extraordinary, the extent to which European leaders and the United States are tiptoeing around what might or might not be acceptable to the Russians when it comes to security guarantees?
Yes, they are tiptoeing around it, and I think Russia is going to play the long game on this, and I think the reason they're playing for time is that they won't be at all disappointed. In one sense, they won't be disappointed if these peace talks break down, and they will blame the United States and primarily and the Europeans in equal measure for the breakdown, and they will say, well, for example, they could say your security guarantees are totally unacceptable. We've always said that Ukraine can't be a member of NATO, but what you're setting up is Ukraine de facto being defended by NATO, and that's unacceptable to Russians. It's unacceptable to Russia. So go back and think again. Well, you know, it's quite hard to. The Europeans have had this before in other parts of the world where a security force has been required, and the host countries, if I can put it that way, have not agreed to it being either NATO, a NATO organization, or a US-led organization. A small example of that would be in Chad and the Central African Republic back in about 2009-10, I think it was, when there was a general agreement by the governments of Chad and Central African Republic that they wanted an international force to come in and police their borders, or help police their borders, to stop the Darfur conflict spreading into the Central African Republic and Chad. But for various complex regional political reasons, the US was not an acceptable force nor acceptable leadership. Likewise, NATO for the same reason. And the UN couldn't do it because they were discredited in that part of the world for other reasons. And it needed an organization that could provide the command and control and the political infrastructure to put that force in place, which was why the European Union took up the cudgels and did it. In fact, I helped set that, didn't help set it up, I set it up as the Director General of the European Union Military Staff. I set up the military side of it anyway. And I think the same may happen with the Russian peace agreement. If the Russians don't want the Americans and the Americans don't want to be on the ground, the Russians may say it's unacceptable to have a NATO command and control system running this operation. Then it may be that we have to look for other ways of running the operation. The European Union would be one way of doing it, but even that's anathema to the Russians, because the Russians don't want the Ukrainians defended either by NATO, and they don't really want them in the European Union either. Sure. So I think the Russians will keep on throwing problems back at the Western alliance, if I can put it that way, to play this long, to keep kicking it into the long grass and blaming the West on not making or offering arrangements that are remotely acceptable to Russia. So, but I go back to the original point. The question is, does Russia want peace or not? On the one hand, are they prepared to carry on with their strategic objectives and pay the cost for that? Or on the other hand, are they prepared to stop at where they are now in order not to compromise the economic position of the country?
All right, and just lastly, I mean, you were one of the early advocates of heavy military hardware being made available to help Ukraine win the war. You're quoted as such, even 2 years ago. I mean, it doesn't seem like Ukraine was given the support it needed when it needed it, which was in those early days. I mean, does this all look to you like a series of missed opportunities? And if so, how and where would you apportion blame?
Well, I think the problem was back in the early days. It's almost hard to remember how it happened. The assistance given to the Ukrainians took a long time to ramp up because, and this was one of the problems. For example, take artillery and tanks and armored fighting vehicles generally, infantry carrying vehicles and so on. None of the European member states really shared many of these in common. So the British tanks and the French tanks were different. And so Ukrainians had to be brought across to the UK and France in order to be trained on not just how to operate a tank, but how to service and maintain them and put spare parts into them. And a supply chain had to be set up from the UK to service those tanks on the front line in Ukraine. And that took a very, very long time. People underestimate that. On the other hand, some of the support to Ukraine was instantaneous. So a lot of, if I can put it, soft support, so intelligence sharing, communication sharing, but particularly intelligence sharing, that was instantaneous. And the supply of, for example, ammunition to Ukraine and cash from the European Union, that was instantaneous. Where there were some problems, and I think criticism of the Europeans is justified, where there were problems were some member states, some European member states, particularly European Union member states, were unwilling because they were equivocal about their support for Ukraine. Germany had severe reservations, partly for historical, but mostly political reasons. Hungary, as you know, was on Russia's side, as Slovakia. So the Europeans weren't anyway unanimous and together, and that made for its own particular difficulties.
Okay. All right. We're going to leave it there because we're out of time, but thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Really a pleasure talking to you, as always, Lieutenant General David Leakey. Thank you for your time, sir. Well, in other news, we're going to turn our attention now to Syria, where efforts are underway to contain sectarian violence, which has followed on from the fall of the former regime, particularly in Druze majority areas like the city of Sueda. Well, state media is reporting that Syria's foreign minister met an Israeli delegation in Paris today to discuss de-escalation following on from last month's deadly clashes. Well, let's get more on that, and we can speak now to Ambassador Barbara Leaf, former United States Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, who joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Ambassador,
thanks for having me on, John.
In your capacity as the State Department's top Middle East diplomat back in 2024, in December of 2024, you met the new Syrian leader and the new leaders in Damascus. The United States at the time offered that new leadership support, and it seems the Trump administration has continued in the same vein. So can I assume that you agree with President Trump's strategy of welcoming President Ahmad al-Shara into the international fold?
Yes, I do. Look, I think the smart thing to do was to give him the space to succeed or fail, give him the space to engage forthrightly in the economic realm with regional states who were very vested in the success of the new Syria and in stabilizing that country.
I mean, you were very quick getting to Damascus in December of last year. I'm just wondering why you thought it was necessary to get there as quickly as you did after the downfall of Bashar al-Assad on the 8th of December.
Well, look, I mean, it was a once in a generation sort of event that you had 50 plus years of a really brutal family enterprise end in a breathtaking fashion. And the first opportunity for that country alongside Lebanon, was starting on its own political transition. So it was a critical moment to lay eyes on and engage with this new leader, whom we knew at a distance, whom we knew principally through the prism of his previous career, fighting U.S. forces and then gradually consolidating power in Syria over a very large swath of the country and 4 million people. So it was quite important for us to have an understanding of what he was about, what he planned, and report back, including sharing that set of impressions. And they were impressions. It was an hour and a half engagement. So it couldn't be more than that, but sharing that with the incoming team.
I mean, those events in December of last year took everyone by surprise. I mean, did you see the writing on the wall for Bashar al-Assad? Did you see it coming when it came?
No, the way I thought about Syria in those last couple of years was that sooner or later, a lot of really terrible chickens would come home to roost. That there would be pressures there that would accumulate precisely because of the effect of the events of the Gaza conflict, the effect on Iran of its efforts to mobilize its axis of resistance, which ultimately against Israel, which ultimately led to a pretty shattering set of attacks by Israel against Hezbollah and a series of attacks or military exchanges between Israel and Iran. So there was always pressure that the Israelis were putting on Syria in that period. But yes, I was as surprised as anyone that all of a sudden, from one minute to the next, Assad fled. It was quite remarkable, and even the fighters themselves that made up Shara's large tent, shall we say, were surprised by how easily they swept down from Aleppo to Damascus.
Given how quickly everything happened, you didn't have much time to prepare for those early meetings. And probably the people on the other side of the table, by the sound of things, didn't have much time to prepare for those meetings either. But what was agreed on in those 1.5 hour long talks? What was committed to?
So I had about a week to prepare. I was in Amman waiting for Washington to finalize its decision that I would go in, that I would meet with Shara himself, that I would go in with Roger Carstens, our special envoy for hostage affairs. And so we had quite a bit of time to think through the discussion, and I had a set of messages to convey to him about sort of the primacy of certain things for us, which included, of course, the quest to find Austin, to find out what had occurred to him, to bring him home if at all possible, but also to look for other. To get the commitment of that government to assist us with other such quests, but also importantly, the counterterrorism piece to pick up the fight against ISIS and carry it forth. We discussed really everything possible, including governance issues. So commitments, I would say, it was more of us laying down a set of messages, previewing that, of course, there was a new administration coming in that we could expect would have its own, of course, deliberations over how they would engage or not. But also for any U.S. government, this question of counterterrorism was going to be quite important.
You mentioned how, there was an inevitability about how things were going to be difficult for Syria in transition, especially after its history, especially after 13, 14 years of civil war. And there are today some obvious issues in Syria, particularly violence involving minorities, whether they be religious minorities, former Assad loyalists. I mean, there is a degree, isn't there, though, of inevitability about all of this, isn't there?
Look, I start from the perspective that as horrible and brutal as that 13, 14 years of war were, the war that Assad waged on his own people with the robust assistance of Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, there was a longer history, which also was always going to make the first transitional government's task enormous. And in fact, one could argue that history shows around the world that such transitions have a very high failure rate. And look at the issues. The Assad family, father and son, spent decades setting communities against one another, not just minority against majority, but minority communities against one another, and really working to deepen cleavages all through society. And it's a way of course, keeping everybody unsettled, weakened, coup-proofing the regime, etc. But what it left was a long residue of distrust. And of course, you have places in the country, in the Northeast and in Sweden, where you've had decades of sectarian conflict. And so you take away all the trappings of a police state and everything that keeps things contained and controlled. And yes, you can expect an explosion. You can expect these historic tensions to rise up. And then there's a whole question about how Syria, the new Syria and its citizenry, how they engage and how they look at Damascus, this new Damascus. So it was always going to be very difficult. And I think one of the key tests for Shara's success, and I said this to him at the time, would be the degree to which he brought people into governance and into consultations, so that it was not just, as one Syrian said, transplanting Idlib to Damascus and trying to run the city, the country, as he had Idlib.
I mean, President Bashar has had a tough job, hasn't he, these last 9 months? I mean, we look at two countries, Israel and Turkey, that have launched military operations inside his country's borders during the last 9 months. And then, of course, we've got the Assad regime in exile. And, of course, they were masters in peddling fake information, fake news, conspiracy theories online, sowing the seeds of doubt in the minds of everyone covering Syria. I mean, have you got the impression that there have been, external forces like them trying to unsettle and really fan the flames in Syria?
No question, and we saw that within the first days after Assad fled, and Ashara came with HTS to Damascus. As you say, the disinformation and the way that social media weaponizes it, or people, malefactors, weaponize social media to sow all sorts of propaganda, but not just propaganda, rumor and claims and disinformation that can spark unrest. So we saw that in the first days. And although I'm not obviously privy to classified information at this point, I have to assume that is a real threat, because Iran has always taken the approach to places in the region that if they can't have it, nobody can have it. And I think that having been so thoroughly pushed out of Syria very abruptly by both the fact of the new government, but also the extreme animosity of the public towards the Iranians. The IRGC essentially fled in the night, as Assad did. So I think there will indisputably be an effort by Iran to continue to work its way back in, and if it can't, to destabilize Syria.
So just to wrap up the conversation about Syria before we move on to another subject, I mean, all things considered, 9 months on from the start of this transition, this dramatic transition in Syria, which you say took you and everyone else in the world by surprise. What are your main takeaways? Does it look, looking back on it, like it's been an orderly transition?
I don't think you can say it's orderly. I think it's been, with the exception of the really terrible events in July in Ceuta, and of course earlier in March on the coast, it has been a transition that has managed to avoid, for the most part, a lot of violence. And that's not insignificant. However, he is going to be tested and tested again and again. And I think one of the places to watch that is northeast Syria, where you have the same sort of fracture lines, Arab, but in this case, Kurdish divisions and cleavages and possibly armed conflict in the near term.
Ambassador, I'd like to turn our attention to what's been happening in Gaza. We're less than 3 months away from the 2-year anniversary of the 7th of October and the horrific events in Israel, but also the beginning of a horrific chapter for the people of Gaza. Why is it that peace in Gaza is proving to be so elusive?
Look, I mean, there is no question, for me at least professionally, the Gaza conflict was the hardest thing I ever worked on in my 35 plus years of diplomatic life. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is to unwind. You saw remarkably huge numbers of Israelis come out in protests on Sunday in a sort of a national agony about the conflict and the desire, of course, to bring their loved ones home and also the remains of those who perished. And on the other side, you have just a terrible, terrible humanitarian situation that beggars description at this point. I think it's possible, for the first time in a while, it's possible that there will be a partial hostage deal. But the thing that remains unresolved is how to end this conflict and how to close the gap, as it were, or reconcile two really irreconcilable quests. The still unfinished war aimed to Israeli war aimed to totally destroy Hamas, which by every reckoning of every military professional I've spoken to, both American, European, Arab, but also many Israelis, can't be done by military terms alone. And on the other hand, Hamas is the only standard for victory is that it survives. Well, you've got 2 million people who are living in the midst of this terrible situation. So there needs to be a political resolution to it all. And I have long argued that Hamas should not be the one at the table that is the party to that negotiation, that it is unreasonable to exclude the Palestinian Authority as the partner. They are the natural partner. And then you will get the Arab community coming in behind that to help take Gaza to what it badly needs, which is out of the conflict and into a post-conflict recovery phase.
And yet, peace is looking like it maybe even further into the distance, because Israel is now planning, we're told, to carry out a military offensive to, quote, conquer Gaza City. Israel's defense minister is calling up around 60,000 reservists. That's going to make an acute humanitarian crisis even worse. Do you get the impression that Israel continues to have Washington's full blessing when it says it's going to go ahead and do something like that?
Well, the president spoke again this week and said, get on with it, destroy Hamas as fast as you can. With all due respect, that's easy to say. It's proven impossible to do. So destroy Hamas as a formal sort of terrorist army, as the Israelis have always called it, an organized military. Yes, that has been done. They are a disaggregated force. They are more of an insurgent force, which makes it all the harder to get at them in military terms, and certainly to get at them without crushing civilian casualties and damage. So that takes you to a political a resolution to all of this. They have achieved one of their most important aims, which was to destroy Hamas's military capabilities, again, as an organized force. So as many people have said, including Israelis, take the win, which is a huge one, and now pivot to the political path of what comes after, and how to govern and secure Gaza in a way that Hamas is squeezed out. But you got to squeeze them out politically, and you only do that by offering an alternative that can take that space. And it won't happen immediately. But then Israel has had decades of experience of dealing with terrorist groups, not in a one-off, one-go, get at them one time with one campaign sort of approach, but over a course of years. And this is the same thing with Hamas.
Okay, and yet here we are in a situation where it looks like there could even be an escalation in Gaza, as we've been saying, involving up to around 60,000 reservists. Just lastly, I mean, the French president's one of the world leaders who's expressed alarm at that proposition. He says it risks dragging the entire region into a state of permanent war. Those are the words of President Emmanuel Macron today. Do you share that concern?
Well, I don't know if I see it as permanent war, but certainly permanent insecurity that just spreads and spreads immutably in every direction. Permanent insecurity, permanent instability. And in fact, you know, again, going back to Syria and Lebanon, for the first time in 4 or 5 decades, you have two pieces of what has historically been one of the most unstable parts of the region, the Levant, and which crowds upon Jordan and Iraq and Israel in security terms. You have the prospect of taking the military wins there and turning them into political capital. But that can only happen with a larger effort at stabilization. And Gaza is very much a part of that. It inflames the Arab public, and it is a seedbed for radicalization of a very dangerous kind for the future.
Ambassador Leaf, I feel like we could talk a lot longer, and I do hope you'll talk to us again in the future, especially about
Anytime,
events
Tom.
in Lebanon. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Ambassador Barbara Leaf, former US Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Well, we're going to stay in the Middle East for our next story and continue focusing on Gaza, where the humanitarian crisis is worsening by the day. Well, at the Rafah border crossing, hundreds of aid trucks remain trapped in the Egyptian desert, with Israel continuing to block life-saving supplies from entering the enclave. Well, that's according to aid groups. Well, during the course of the last 24 hours, local authorities say that 3 more Palestinians have died in Gaza from starvation. Well, for more on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, I'm joined now by ICRC spokesperson Hashem Oseiran. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Hashem. The latest we're hearing is that there were Israeli strikes overnight. More people were killed. The total death toll in Gaza now stands at more than 62,000. What's the latest you're hearing about the current situation in Gaza?
Thank you for having me. As you mentioned, we continue to hear worrying reports of more death, of more destruction. After nearly 2 years, the people of Gaza are exhausted. What we're hearing from our teams on the ground is there is more fear of more violence, of more displacement, and it is unacceptable that after all of this time, that the civilian population in Gaza still has to endure so much hostilities.
Hashem, I know everyone is running out of words to describe the situation across the Gaza Strip, but what's left? I mean, how would you describe the situation as it stands right now?
The situation in Gaza is nothing short of a nightmare. It's catastrophic and it keeps getting worse. And it's unacceptable right now that it's at risk of even getting the situation deteriorating even further. People are in need of everything. They need food, they need water, they need medicine, and more than anything, they need safety.
I mean, food scarcity, nutrition, these have been issues for some months now. I mean, how can we categorize the situation now using the correct terminology? What are we looking at? A famine?
I mean, the ICRC is not a food actor that's going to categorize in terminology. What we can say is what we see on the ground. And what we see on the ground is we operate a field hospital. And in the field hospital, we're seeing increasingly patients who are arriving malnourished. We support community kitchens and baking facilities, and we're seeing endless queues. We're seeing people who are crying of hunger. And so what we're really seeing on the ground is really severe food scarcity and food shortages. The ICRC has 350 staff on the ground in Gaza. Even the ICRC staff are struggling to secure enough food and safe water. And so the absolute scarcity of all essential items, not just food, but also water, but also medicine is appalling.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask you about one of the communiques that the ICRC has put out with regards to one of the field hospitals you operate, this one in Rafah, where it's been reported that 4,500 wounded patients have been treated, people who'd been shot at, we're told, whilst trying to get hold of food. I mean, just tell us about the sorts of injuries that were reported there and what explanation there is for them.
So since the new food distribution sites were launched around May 27, our field hospital in Rafah has received an unprecedented wave of mass casualty incidents. We have received over 4,500 weapon wounded patients. We're seeing all kinds of injuries. They're mostly gunshot wounds, but we've also treated shrapnel injuries. And what this suggests to us is there's a very worrying security environment around the food distribution sites. Most of the people that were admitted to the field hospital said that they were injured while trying to get food for their families. And so this is very worrying for us. The field hospital was established in May 2024. We've never seen this number of patients. We've never seen this number of cases.
And how are the doctors in those field hospitals able to cope with the volume of patients and give them the treatment they need? I mean, these must be extremely difficult circumstances for them to work in.
Well, to give you context, the Red Cross Field Hospital has 60 beds. And there are mass casualty incidents in which we've received 130 patients, 170 patients. So we're talking about more than double the capacity of the hospital. Doctors are struggling to cope with the size of the influx. Patients are being treated on benches, on stretchers, on beds. Medical equipment is dwindling. And so the doctors are doing the best they can to treat all of the cases that are coming in. Sometimes that means you have to put other cases on hold. If you have maternity cases, or if you have usual cases for follow-up, all of that is put onto the side, and all of the attention is put into just treating the patients that are coming in huge numbers.
What is the ICRC allowed to do in Gaza? Because we know that some aid groups face restrictions. I want to know what restrictions you face.
Well, the ICRC has been in Gaza since before October 7, and we will continue to work in Gaza, and we plan to continue to work in Gaza. What we do is a whole range of activities. This includes the Red Cross Field Hospital in Rafah, which is the last fully functioning field hospital in Rafah. We also support community kitchens and common baking ovens, which provide people with sometimes the only meals that they will eat that day. We also try to facilitate access to essential infrastructure and essential services, including water and electricity. We're also supporting in building latrines and bathrooms in displacement camps where sanitation is becoming a major issue. And this is just a snapshot into the range of activities that the ICRC conducts in Gaza. In terms of the challenges we're facing very similar challenges to many other aid groups that are working on the ground. Primarily, Gaza is an active hostility zone. So security is a major issue. We have risk when it comes to movement. We have risks when it comes to access. More than 80% of Gaza's territory is impacted by evacuation orders, which also makes access very difficult for humanitarian workers. Roads are destroyed. They're filled with unexploded ordinances. And again, I stress the main problem is security. The ICRC has lost 6 of its staff members since October 7th. at least 2 of our premises have been hit. And so it's the challenges that exist on the ground are just immense.
Yeah, I mean, clearly an extremely challenging, extremely dangerous place for humanitarian people to work, including, as you say, your colleagues from the ICRC. I want to ask you about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is supposed to be providing food to people in need there in Gaza, and yet there have been multiple reports of how catastrophic and chaotic that distribution process has been. Does the ICRC offer any assistance, any guidance, any advice to the GHF, or do you operate completely separately from them?
So the ICRC doesn't currently collaborate with the GHF, nor do we cooperate with the GHF. The ICRC has been very clear. We cannot work under any aid mechanism that does not respect the fundamental principles of impartiality and neutrality. We have continued to call for an aid mechanism that can reach people safely and where they are, and that can be delivered in a way that upholds their dignity. We have continued to make these calls publicly, and our position on this is very well known. Now, in terms of engagement, the ICRC engages with all actors in relation to Gaza, and this includes the GHF. But that does not mean that we endorse the actions of any individual or group.
Okay, and of course, part of your being neutral and an intermediary here means that you are in a position to, for example, visit the hostages on both sides. And I'm wondering whether you are willing to do that and whether that's likely to happen.
The ICRC has been ready since day one. We have repeatedly demanded that all hostages be released. We have also repeatedly asked for continuous access to all of the hostages. But access is not automatic. Access needs to be granted. We do not know where the hostages are. We do not know how to access them. And in order for there to be access, there first needs to be an agreement between the parties, between Israel and Hamas. So this is key for us in order to be able to access all of the hostages. We need an agreement in place.
And, you know, while there might be a lot of hope that the situation will improve, what we're hearing from Israel would suggest otherwise. Israel threatening to escalate its campaign in Gaza, calling up some 60,000 reservists, really planning to conquer, they say, Gaza City. Those are their words. What would such an escalation mean for the people of Gaza, do you think?
For the people of Gaza, it means more desperation. It means more violence. It means more displacement. After 2 years, people are exhausted. What they need is relief, not more pressure. What they need is safety, not more displacement. And what we're hearing from our colleagues on the ground is that there are many people who will not leave, who will stay, because they are tired of moving time and time again at a time when nowhere in Gaza really feels safe. And this is why every minute without a ceasefire is costing lives. The ICRC has continuously called for a ceasefire to be reinstated. And that's essential for a civilian population that has really been driven to despair over nearly 2 years of hostilities.
And just lastly, Hashem, and briefly, if you will, one thing the ICRC has communicated online in the last couple of days, they say the window for saving lives in Gaza is closing. The time to act is now. Just to wrap up this conversation, who needs to do what?
First and foremost, the parties need to reach an agreement. We need a ceasefire agreement. And that is the responsibility of Israel and Hamas. Besides the parties to the conflict, states also have a role to play. States must ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. They must ensure respect for international humanitarian law. And that includes by allowing the rapid and unimpeded entry of humanitarian assistance into Gaza.
Okay, thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. ICRC spokesperson Hashem Oseidam, thank you very much for your time, sir. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.